The annals of military history are replete with examples of warriors who botched crucial missions, from bumbling Roman generals to overzealous American lieutenants. These gaffes and the wars that ensued were the defining characteristics of battles as recent as World War II and as distant in history as the Second Punic War. The failure of these commanders and their troops to properly assess the threat posed by the adversary or the nature of the terrain on the battlefield was the root cause of all of the calamities that ensued. We'll cover 10 most catastrophic errors in the annals of military history. The Romans at the Battle of Cannae. In the year 216 BC, Hannibal Barca is credited with becoming the first person to successfully cross the Alps into Italy with only 40,000 troops. To fight against him, a massive Roman army consisting of around 80,000 soldiers was assembled and led by the two Roman consuls. The Roman leaders of this enormous force made a catastrophic mistake at Cannae, which resulted in the loss of the majority of their troops. At Cannae, the Roman generals devised a strategy in which they would attack and attempt to punch through Hannibal's thin battle line, putting their reliance in their significantly bigger infantry force. Hannibal, on the other hand, had meticulously planned out his tactics. First, he gave the command for his men to act as though they were withdrawing from the center of their formation, which drew the eager Romans into the crescent-shaped battle line he had formed. The Romans, unaware of the situation, falsely believed they had the Carthaginians on the run and drove their forces farther into this crescent in the hope of trapping them there. After driving off the horsemen that shielded the Roman flank, Hannibal's cavalry swung around the back of the massive Roman force and charged their rear. This was a successful move for Hannibal. The Roman commanders did not realize their error in time, and as a result, they were surrounded by the Carthaginian infantry in the form of a crescent formation at the front of the battlefield, while Hannibal's cavalry drove into their rear. Because there were so many Roman soldiers crammed into this trap set by the Carthaginians, the Roman soldiers were unable to even wield their swords. Aemilius Paulus, one of the Roman consuls, was among the approximately 60,000 Romans who were killed as a direct result of the overconfidence displayed by their generals. It is considered to be one of the bloodiest days in the history of Western military conflicts, ranking alongside the Battle of the Somme. Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae. At the Battle of Carrhae, which took place in 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus and his Roman troops were completely and thoroughly defeated by the Parthians. Crassus made the error of failing to recognize the significance of the terrain as well as the abilities of the Parthian horse archers. This cost him the battle. In order to track down the Parthian army and capture them, Crassus led a force of 40,000 legionaries and auxiliary men into the desert. He did not heed the counsel of his allies and advisors who had suggested that he remain in the mountains or close to the Euphrates in order to lessen the threat posed by the Parthian cavalry. He ignored their advice. The Romans were assaulted by the Parthians while they were deep in the desert. The heat and dehydration had weakened them significantly. Crassus made an incorrect estimation of the size of the Parthian army, and as a result, he ordered his men to create an immobile square that was afterwards destroyed by the Parthian horse archers. When Crassus ordered his troops to pursue the enemy, they were met with a charge from the cataphracts, the heavy cavalry of the Parthians. The several mistakes that Crassus made led to his own demise as well as the deaths of his son and 20,000 Roman soldiers. Additionally, he was responsible for the loss of 6 legionary eagles, which served as Roman military standards and were not found for nearly 30 years. The Romans at the Teutoburg Forest. In the course of their extensive military career, the Romans suffered very few defeats that had as profound an effect on them as that of Varus's armies at the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. When Emperor Augustus learned of the calamity, he is reported to have repeatedly shouted out to Quintilius Varus in his head, "Give me back my legions," after receiving the news. The first mistake that Varus made was to place his faith in Arminius, a chieftain from Germania who was working in the role of counselor to Varus. After receiving word from Arminius that a rebellion had recently arisen in the area, Varus led his army through the Teutoburg Forest in order to put an end to the conflict. Varus grossly underestimated the organization of the Germanic tribes as well as their ability to utilize the local terrain. He did not reconnoiter the woodland, nor did he even march his army in fighting formation. As the Romans made their way through the thick forest, they were abruptly surprised by an ambush by a well-disciplined Germanic army that was camouflaged in the undergrowth and led by Arminius himself. Only a few thousand Romans managed to get away, and Varus himself was eventually driven to take his own life during the conflict. The Roman Empire was unable to maintain a solid grasp on Germania because of Arminius's triumph, which prevented this from happening. The French at the Battle of Agincourt. On the morning of October 25, 1415, the French army that was stationed at Agincourt probably believed that they were about to win a spectacular victory. Their army had a significant numerical advantage over the English host led by Henry V, and they fielded a significantly higher number of knights and men-at-arms than the English did. However, the French made a catastrophic error when they misjudged the accuracy, range, and fire rate of the English longbows, which led to their defeat. During the course of the conflict, the French cavalry attempted to rush the English archers, but due to the pointed stakes that protected them, they were unable to do so. In the meantime, the French men-at-arms made their way slowly through the muddy ground that separated them from the English. Under these circumstances, the entire French army was in a position where it was extremely susceptible to the continuous barrage of arrows fired by the English longbows. When the French eventually broke through the arrows and reached Henry V's lines, they were quickly driven back and soundly defeated. Because of their errors, the French suffered around 10 times as many casualties as the English did during the conflict. The Austrians at the Battle of Karánsebes. During the Austro-Turkish War, on the night of September 21st, 1788, the Austrian army, which was commanded by Emperor Joseph II, suffered a severe loss at the hands of friendly fire and ended up defeating itself. The Austrian hussars, who were working as scouts at the time, refused to share their schnapps with some of the infantry, which led to the beginning of the fighting between the Austrian troops. When one of the inebriated hussars opened fire, the infantry retaliated by firing their weapons as well. During the battle between the two factions, the parties heard yells of "Turks! Turks!" which led them to believe that the Ottomans were in the area. The hussars ran back into the Austrian camp, and a bewildered officer gave the order for his artillery to fire upon the fleeing soldiers. Because of the darkness, the Austrians were under the impression that the Ottoman cavalry was sneaking up on them and turned violently against one another out of fear. During the course of the night, about 1,000 Austrians were put to death, and Emperor Joseph II issued an order for a general retreat as a result of the pandemonium. After delaying their arrival by 2 days, the Ottomans were able to take Karánsebes without any resistance. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Napoleon's invading force that he recruited for his campaign against Russia was the greatest army that had ever been amassed in the history of military conflict. The invasion of Afghanistan was started by about 685,000 soldiers from France and Germany who crossed the Niemen River. Napoleon's army would suffer 500,000 losses as a result of the failure to coerce the Russians into surrendering and the drawn-out retreat that followed. Napoleon had a mistaken belief that the Russians would engage in a decisive combat with their army, but instead, they retreated deeper into Russian territory. This led to Napoleon's defeat. As the Russians withdrew from the area, they leveled fields and villages, making it impossible for Napoleon to provide food and water to his massive army. Napoleon was able to inflict an inconclusive defeat on the Russians and capture Moscow, but even the capital city had been demolished by the retreating army by the time he got there. Napoleon withdrew his forces from Moscow after wasting time waiting in vain for Emperor Alexander I to capitulate. The French army was slowed down as winter approached by the snows, which caused them to suffer from famine and desertion as the Russians hurried their long retreat. The charge of the Light Brigade. This British light cavalry charge during the Battle of Balaclava is widely regarded as one of the most infamous examples of poor strategy in the annals of military history. The charge was made famous by a poem written by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Due to a breakdown in communication within the chain of command, the Light Brigade was given the mission of launching a direct attack against a significant Russian artillery battery. As the Light Brigade surged through the so-called Valley of Death between the Fedyukin Heights and the Causeway Heights, they were met with devastating fire from all three sides. They were able to reach the cannon but were ultimately forced back and received more fire while retreating. In the end, the misunderstanding was responsible for approximately 300 casualties that were sustained in a matter of minutes. Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is widely recognized as one of the most pivotal conflicts in the annals of United States military history. Because of his actions during the fight known as the Last Stand against the troops of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was revered as an American hero for many decades following the conflict. Historians of the modern era have chronicled several errors committed by Custer both before and during the conflict, which ultimately resulted in a decisive victory for the war chiefs and tribal leaders Crazy Horse and Gall. Notably, Custer made a significant underestimate of the number of adversaries who were camped before the Little Bighorn River. He did this by rejecting the information made by his native scouts, who stated that the encampment was the largest they had ever seen. Before launching an assault, Custer was also instructed to wait for the men under the command of Brigadier General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibson to arrive. Instead, Custer made the decision to launch his attack right away out of fear that the Sioux and Cheyennes would flee the area if he waited any longer. Custer was compelled to retreat his own battalion to a neighboring hill, where they met with repeated assaults and ultimately met their deaths there. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. One of the most important military operations in history was Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, which was an invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 that was ultimately unsuccessful. As a result of the invasion, Germany was forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously, which brought their strained military to the brink of collapse. Hitler, like Napoleon before him, grossly miscalculated the determination of the Russians, as well as the challenges of providing his men for the geography and climate of Russia. He was under the impression that his army might conquer Russia in a few weeks. Thus, he did not adequately prepare his troops for the severe Russian winter. As a result of Germany's loss in the biggest battle in history, which took place at Stalingrad, Hitler was compelled to shift forces from the Western Front to the Russian front, which weakened his hold on Europe. During the course of the battle, which proved to be a turning point in the Second World War, the Axis powers sustained casualties equaling close to 1 million people. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the target of a preemptive attack by the Japanese on the morning of December 7, 1941. This attack was directed against the American naval base located there. The Japanese government had planned the strike as a preventative measure in the expectation that it would discourage the United States Pacific Fleet from obstructing Japanese territorial expansion into Southeast Asia. Instead, the strike resulted in the United States of America joining the Allies and participating in the Second World War. The initial attack on Pearl Harbor, which coincided with subsequent strikes on American naval facilities, was considered a victory for the Japanese military. There was a loss of life of 2,400 American service members, the sinking of 4 battleships, and heavy damage to many more ships. On the other hand, the Japanese were unable to land a decisive blow, and as a result, public opinion in the United States shifted away from isolationism and toward involvement in the war. Not only did the United States contribute to turning the tide of the fight in Europe over the course of the next years, but they also helped bring an end to the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.